Welcome to the Progress Texas Happy Hour.
Welcome to the Progress Texas Happy Hour. I'm Executive Director Kathleen Thompson.
And I'm Podcasting Director Chris Mosier.
Former Congressman Colin Allred has been one of the most talked about Democrats in Texas for years now, since he first displaced Republican Congressman Pete Sessions in the U.S. House back in 2018 and served there for 6 years through 2024, when he left the Congress to run against Senator Ted Cruz.
Congressman Allred became the first to announce a second run for the Senate this year against John Cornyn, but lately has made news in dropping out of that race, opting instead to run for the newly redrawn 33rd Congressional District, which includes his childhood neighborhood in Dallas.
We've looked forward for a long time to talking with him, and we appreciate the opportunity to hear about how he sees the current moment, including the all-important midterms in 2026. Congressman Colin Allred, welcome to the show.
All right. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Let's start with this most recent news. As you've pivoted from a second Senate run, as I said, to a run to return to the U.S. House, widely seen as kind of part of the chain reaction that's been set off by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's last-minute entry into the Senate race. It's widely known that Congresswoman Crockett consulted with both you and Austin State Rep James Tallarico as she was deciding whether or not to make that run. What can you tell us about your conversation with her and how her Senate run has influenced your choice to pivot to CD 33?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I've known Jasmine for a long time. We've known each other since before we were in elected office. And, you know, did voting rights work, and she was a lawyer. And so we came across each other. And I've served with her in Congress. We represented Dallas together. So I know her very well. And so we had a professional and friendly conversation. You know, I was surprised as anybody that this was something that she really wanted to do. But I think when you've, had a chance to go around our state the way I have, and when you have developed the trust and the relationships that I had developed around the state, and when people feel like they can tell you their personal stories and what they're going through, and tell you their hopes and their dreams and their struggles, that a responsibility comes along with that. And I felt the responsibility to make sure that we had a unified party going into November, but also that we gave those folks who I talked to the best chance of having, a senator who would actually represent them. And I thought that a bruising primary is one thing, but then having a runoff guaranteed, that in Texas, we don't really have, I think, the luxury of that. The Republicans can do that because they're oftentimes the incumbents and they've got the infrastructure in place to do that. I don't think we do. And so I felt that if there was another way that I could serve, that would be something that I wanted to do. And, this district that I'm running to represent, let's be very clear. I wish that it didn't exist in terms of the lines that it has been drawn, because it is a racial gerrymander, right? A 3-judge panel with a Trump appointee judge said this is a racial gerrymander. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court overruled it. And it is a district that's going to need a strong voice in it. And I think I can be that.
Congressman, there's been a lot made lately about Republicans taking action via their own polling, seeding of progressive digital spaces in an attempt to encourage Congresswoman Crockett to jump in, seeing her as a candidate they'd prefer to face in November, believing she will energize Republicans to show up. What's your take on this reporting of active manipulation in Democratic politics by Republicans?
Well, I think that this is something that's not a surprise to me. And, if you've run in tough races like I have, you know that there's almost nothing that the Republicans won't do to try and, tilt the playing field, in what they think may be their favor. I think ultimately, though, what we have to have, is a unified party to make sure that whoever becomes the nominee, that we can support them and go into November, all pulling in the same direction. And my concern, as I just said, was that the process as I saw it playing out was that was not going to be the case. And I felt really strongly that, it was my responsibility as sort of the, person who had run before, but also who had, had the opportunity to be all around the state, to hear folks' stories, and to have that responsibility of their, looking out for what I thought was in their best interest, to find a way that I could best serve. And so that's what I am trying to do. I know what the Republicans are always trying to do, which is to take whatever they can get to win an election so they can then stick it to working people. And that's what they've been doing, throughout this congressional session. The last election, they talked about lowering people's costs. All they did was go in and make it much more expensive through tariffs. They're taking away healthcare, taking away, food benefits, attacking our education systems. So to me, we have to be united in stopping that. And that I think is bigger than any one person.
Very, very good. Congressman, as you mentioned, House District 33 has been redrawn as part of Donald Trump's attempted seizure of as many as 5 additional Republican seats in the House. It's a safe Democratic seat, but it has been drawn for broader Republican advantage overall.
That's right.
It does include part of Dallas, or the part of Dallas where you grew up. And while it's kind of hard to think of this artificially designated area, as you mentioned, as a specific cultural sort of boundary, what can you say about the Texans who live within District 33 now as it's drawn? How has this part of Texas changed since you were growing up there? And what do you see as the most important priorities for the person who eventually represents this district in D.C.?
Yeah, I mean, this is as you said, it's a place where I, grew up. It's also where I saw my mom, work as a public school teacher and struggle there. And some of those things haven't changed, unfortunately. I know that there is still a lot of hardworking, Texans who live in this newly drawn 33rd district who are working harder and harder and feel like they're bringing home less. And what I saw around the state as I talked to folks was that people are aware that they are doing everything right, that they're playing by the rules, that they're dropping their kids off at school in the morning, and they're going to work at one job, 2 jobs, and they're coming home at night, and they're seeing that they're bringing home less. But they see openly corrupt folks on television, on their TV, who are just blatantly and offensively corrupt, who are doing just fine. And they recognize that something is off, that the American dream, is falling apart in a way. And I think they're wondering, do you see me? Do you know what I'm going through? Does anybody care? And I certainly do, because this is, my personal story as well. But I also think that, when we talk about, gerrymandering and why they do these things, it's so that they want to rig the election so they can then rig the economy against working folks. And I think that's what we have to keep, our focus on, regardless of the makeup of the district. And this is a heavily majority minority district, one that I think deserves a leader who will understand, those communities. But across the state, what I've seen is that we have an opportunity to talk about what working people are going through and how we can respond to that. But we also have to make sure that we take advantage of that opportunity to shift what the Democratic Party has been perceived to be about, which to me, as I had conversations with folks all over, it became increasingly clear to me that we have to make sure that we recenter ourselves on working people, and that people don't see us as being too elitist or just associated with, folks who might have had the opportunity to go to college and get a graduate degree and do all those things. That we need to make sure we're grounding ourselves back in those everyday Texans who might, have to shower after work instead of before work, but who are hoping that their kids and that the future for them will look brighter if we can just make a shift in priorities to give them a chance. And that's what I think the 33rd district needs, just like the rest of the state.
Congressman, there's the conversation on our side of the aisle, it seems these days, has become one, and it's kind of exemplified by Congresswoman Crockett jumping into the race, is the idea of, does the party need to moderate? Do we need to move to the right? Or can we stick to progressive values and expect to perform well with the electorate beyond doing that? It seems to be a matter of philosophy that comes from personal perspectives. You're a congressman. You're a person who, in the thick of it in D.C., has been known for your bipartisanship and you're working across the aisle to great success in some cases. What's your view right now on what direction the party should best go? Is there really an answer to that? Does it depend on the candidate? What's your take on that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I've increasingly come to recognize that, as you said, we're all shaped by our own experiences in our lives, and that we'll have different strengths and different weaknesses.
Sure.
And I'm less interested in what the national party's conversation is than I am about what's going on in Texas. And I think in Texas, we have to recognize that to be successful statewide, but also I think just to be a voice that's authentically speaking to Texas issues, that we need to be focused on, what's best for Texans, and that sometimes is going to differ from what will be best in New York or in California. And I think we have to be comfortable with that. And I think we have to be able to say that that's not, selling out or something. That's actually what representation means, right? That you actually do know what your district, what your state, like what drives it and what you can do, but that you also know what its challenges are. And I think that's the area that think we need to make sure we spend our time on, is that we know what our strengths are and that we're not going to stand in the way of those, but that we also want to address these challenges that are holding back so much of the potential that we have in Texas. And that the Republicans in Texas have made that potential have much less opportunity for stories like mine, quite frankly, to exist. To go from being raised by a single mother to the NFL and becoming a civil rights lawyer and working for President Obama and all those things, that they're making those stories harder. And so to me, I think we have to stand for opportunity. And I think we can do that in different ways. But I don't think we could ever tell any Texan that we're not interested in them. That's what the Republicans do. When they win elections, they don't care about the folks who didn't vote for them.
Right.
And they're going to go and they're going to enforce their agenda no matter what. I don't think that's what we want to become. I think we want to win elections, yes, certainly, but we will care about all the Texans that we represent. And you mentioned some of my bipartisan work. My bipartisan work was for veterans, for infrastructure, for things like paid family leave. It was things that were not inconsistent with my values. So I think you can stand up for your values and try and find some common ground. And ultimately, that's what most folks are doing every single day when they go to work, in their marriages, in their relationships. We're all having to find common ground. It only seems to be that in politics that we think that maybe we should stop doing that, right? So, with the candidates that we have, they'll have different, strengths, different weaknesses, but I encourage them to speak to all Texans and to run campaigns where everyone can feel like they can be a part of it, and to not exclude anybody from it just based on how they might have voted in the past, because I had a lot of folks who voted for both Donald Trump and for me in the last election. So I've seen how possible it is.
There's a quote from us today from Progress Texas in the Dallas Morning News. We were asked about this very hot race between Rep. Crockett and Rep. Tallarico. And I'm of the opinion that primaries are helpful. And in this case, we need, as Democrats and progressives who want to win elections, more people voting and more people interested and more people to hear about what's happening and what they can do about it. And I was telling the Dallas Morning News that both Reps Crockett and Tallarico are extremely strong communicators. So I think it's a good thing that James and Jasmine are going to be out there talking to people in their own unique ways to get people to be aware that there's an election and why they're the best candidate for the race and how to get involved, how to register to vote. It's very hard to vote in Texas, but also if they are registered already, don't sit out like too many millions of Texans sat out in 2024.
No, that's right. And, listen, my whole career has been about trying to make sure Texans can vote. Since my football career ended up, literally a voting rights lawyer and have fought against the laws that they put in place in the state. And I think it's outrageous, right? But I think that there are contexts where, having competitive races is helpful. That's why they gerrymander these districts. It's because they don't want to have competitive races. If you think back to 2018, a year that was, a good one for us in Texas overall.
That's right.
We had 7 competitive congressional races that year. We flipped, 2 of those races, myself and Lizzie Fletcher in Houston. We flipped, 12 state house seats and came close in another, 10 or so. And we flipped a couple of state Senate seats.
That's right.
And they saw that, right? And they decided we're never going to have that happen again, right? And so they said we're going to have as few competitive elections as possible. And so, I think primaries are always going to be low turnout. And so I sometimes, think that yes, it's important about engaging people, but it's largely going to be our base. But the general election, we are, what we have had is that when they gerrymander these districts and the outcome is predetermined in many cases, they know that doing that also is going to mean that in some of these blue districts that we have, there'll be less efforts to turn out the vote. And what I think we have to commit to as Texans and as Texas Democrats is that in our bluest areas, that we're going to work them as hard as if they were competitive races. That we're going to, even if we don't have the funding that we would for a competitive race, that we're going to make sure that we're doing all the GOTV efforts that we normally would, all of the outreach efforts that we normally would, because we need to get those folks out in those areas. But also, like, as you said, we need to have strong communicators at the top as well. And so it all works in conjunction. And I think we have a chance to do all of it.
I'm really happy to hear that because, as you know, I used to work for the Dallas County Democratic Party under Chair Cardell Coleman. And I can tell you, and insiders will know this, but we see the numbers and lots of new people are listening to our podcasts and seeing our clips. Some of the most Democratic districts are the ones that have the lowest turnout. And on the other side, the Republican side, that's not true. They have strong Republican leanings and they have high voter turnout. And that's just not the case for Democrats. And that has got to change if we want to win statewide elections and to work to organize to help people understand that you want to vote in every election. You want to vote in city councils and municipals and county commissioners courts and your JPs, because these people are going to make decisions about your daily lives. So your voice is so important. So join us in the fight. So I'm really pleased to hear you saying that you're going to be working that hard.
Those districts are also the poorest districts in the state. And I've worked on this for some time. And so when you're talking about, South Dallas, for example, as you know, it's heavily Democratic. It's also has a ton of economic challenges. And so for us in campaigns, the task is not just running against Republicans. It's running against the feeling that nothing can change, right? And that kind of, almost despair is as big an opponent in those areas as the Republicans will be in other areas. And so that's where I think we have to speak with, bold ideas on what we can do to make life better for folks, take those arguments directly to them instead of asking them to come to us. And I hope that, over the course of this campaign, we can do that. But when we're talking about, working class folks who are deciding whether or not voting is in their interest because they don't know if it will change anything, that's where I think we have a real opportunity to say, yes, it is. And here's the ideas of what we're going to do to make it easier for you on home ownership, on healthcare, on education, on helping your kids go to a good school and have options afterwards, on standing up to discrimination. These are the things that we can do to make sure that you and your family can get ahead. And that's why it'll be in your interest to take some of your very, very precious free time that you have little of to be engaged in this democracy of ours.
I'm so glad to hear that. And I hope a minimum wage hike will be a part of that conversation. I have a 16-year-old who got his first job and couldn't believe the pay. And I said, I just want you to understand that this is for the Nikes that you want. You're not trying to support a family on this. And this is what grownups have to live with, because we don't have enough people elected who make decisions that have worked minimum wage jobs.
Yeah, that's right.
So I hope that'll be part of the conversation. Speaking a little bit more about primaries, a side effect of the mid-decade redistricting of Texas, and let's be clear that it's an intended side effect, is the pitting of well-known Democrats against each other. You're in a primary challenge for 33 against Congresswoman Julie Johnson, who was your successor in the U.S. House when you ran for Senate against Ted Cruz. What are your views on how Texas Democrats should run against each other during the primary season, knowing that no matter who wins, no matter who loses, we need all of those people to turn out to vote in the general?
Yeah, no, listen, I'm what I've always done, in primaries is try to make sure that folks know who I am, why I'm running, what I want to do. And then, of course, we can talk about distinctions that are fair. And I think that's a natural part of any election cycle. But I think it all has to be in the interest of overall saying that we know who the real opponents here are, right? And I certainly do. And, I know what the stakes are. And I'll tell you, this is not a normal, election. And that was part of, what went into my decision making as well, is that I've never sensed or seen a level of fear like I've seen around the state in this election. That there are communities that I would go to where the stories were incredibly heartbreaking of the fear that immigrant communities would have, or even not just immigrant communities, but communities that felt like they were being targeted. The fear that we're losing our democracy and that we don't have anybody who is standing up to stop it. The fear that no matter what I do, I feel like I just can't get ahead. And if one crisis hits, this entire house of cards is going to come down. There is a lot of fear. And I think what we have to be focused on is the folks we're trying to represent, not ourselves, right? And that's one thing I always tell people when they ask me about running for office. I'll say, well, just make sure it's not about you, right? Because we have a lot of people who need help. And that's what I've always what this always boils down to for me is how do you help and how do you think you can best help? And I think that I can best help by being a strong voice for us in this district. And I'm sure that Julie does as well, and we'll make our cases.
Very, very good. So it does take courage to give up a U.S. House seat to make a shot at making a bigger impact as you did in 2024. So now you're seeking to get back to the Congress. Tell us about what you recall as some of your more significant accomplishments over the 6 years that you were serving in D.C., and what you see as the most pressing issues for the Congress as a whole to tackle beginning in 2027, especially should the Democrats manage to regain control of the House, as many are hoping and expecting.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I was there for 2 impeachments, and insurrection, and
Right.
a pandemic. I mean, we had a lot that went on, and I was there on January 6th, and I was there, on the floor when the mob was trying to break in, and I've told the story, of course, before, but I've taken off my suit jacket and thinking I was going to have to hold back, the mob at a door while my colleagues escaped.
Right.
And so for me, this is it's not hypothetical when I talk about losing our democracy. And I'm proud that just this district alone, even though it's a newly made up district, that I've delivered $135 million in funding for it, in local housing and transportation and healthcare, that veterans will go to a veteran VA hospital that I created that would not exist were it not for me. I got a recently closed down Baylor Scott and White Hospital donated to the VA at a value of over $400 million. I'm proud of those accomplishments. But what I feel really strongly is that this is a completely different time, and that we have to go in with a very different attitude in terms of what we are hoping to do. I think for much of my congressional career, the attitude was often, well, there are some great things that we've done, particularly in the Obama administration, that we have to defend. Many of those accomplishments have been destroyed. And what we've seen is when you have a Department of Education, for example, that's totally gone. The question we have to answer is, well, what's going to come next, right? And I think it can't just be that we're going to bring it back how it was. I don't think that's a legitimate goal, and I don't think many people would be very responsive to that out there in the real world. I think what we have to say to them is, we're going to use the forest fire that is Donald Trump to rebuild a better, more representative, and more accessible government for you, right? And that we will be there to create opportunities, and that we know we can't create outcomes, but we can be there to create opportunities. And so to me, as dark as this time is, there's also the belief that it's always darkest before the dawn, and that we may have the opportunity in this darkness to start looking forward and saying, what can the future look like? Now, all that is dependent on us having free and fair elections,
Right.
being able to stand up to a completely out of control president who is, I think, hourly shredding the Constitution, and who I believe in his heart of hearts does not want to leave the White House ever again. Right? And so we have to make sure that we have a Democratic Congress, as we did on January 6, 2021, a Democratic Congress to ensure a fair election and that there's a transfer of power, if that's the will of the country, which I think there's a good chance that it will be.
I think there is a good chance that it will be, looking at what just happened in the November elections that we just saw, with a blue wave from California to the East Coast and liberal bastions like Mississippi. Yeah, so I'm feeling good about
And Miami.
That's right. It's still going. That's right. Congressman, one of your last votes as a member of Congress was HR 9495, and that would have given the Trump administration power to strip nonprofits over terrorism claims, and that would be air quotes terrorism claims, without courts or oversights. And that resolution was dubbed the nonprofit killer by groups as diverse as the Sandy Hook Parents and the Sierra Club, and even NAACP. Some Dems who had supported it under a likely, which was not likely, Kamala Harris administration, changed their votes, and that included Congressman Lloyd Doggett. You were one of more than a dozen Democrats who voted yes. And I would love for you to explain if you still feel like that was the right move. Do you stand by that vote? If you would share about that, we'd love to hear.
Yeah, listen, I mean, I don't remember all the details about that particular vote, but what I will say is that there were other components of it that I did support, and I thought that they were important, including dealing with folks who had been wrongfully detained overseas, and I'd been working closely with Austin Tice's mother on some issues around getting him back. I'd also worked with Brittany Griner's family on bringing her back. And so, like with many things, it's often more complicated than it might seem. And so, also this was a piece of legislation that had passed overwhelmingly previously, and then the concern was that, well, because we had Trump coming in, that now we weren't going to be for it. And I think that in general, you don't pass legislation just for one president. You try and pass it for the future. And when it comes to dealing with terrorism, those assessments can, obviously they can be abused, but we also need to make sure that if an entity has something to do with terrorism, that it can be targeted. And unfortunately, there are nonprofits that have been involved in that in the past. And so there's always components of individual votes that are going to be complicated. But what I have always tried to do, and I think my voting record reflects that, is do what I think is best for my community, not just for the moment, but for the long run. And so that's whether it's that vote or anything else, we can't just be, as I see it, saying that we're going to have policies just for a specific concern. We have to have policies to make sure that they can stand the test of time, and that's how I tried to approach it.
The language in that particular bill, clearly a lot of our allied organizations, including ourselves, operating as a nonprofit ourselves, we saw as very much a potential weaponization against us and what we do. Since that vote, over the last, almost a year now, we've seen the word terrorism thrown around willy-nilly by the Trump administration. We've seen the idea that Antifa would somehow be a label that could be applied to who knows who, based on who knows what, along with the label of terrorism, which then would also come along with this kind of, lethal weapon sort of legislation situation. Does any of that over the last year make you think about that vote, or think about, like, should you end up back in the Congress, how do you intend to, stand up against this type of language that's become increasingly common, vague language that could be used to target just about anybody that Donald Trump should determine as an enemy of his? Talk about that, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the problem is that we should not have elected Donald Trump, and that if you have laws that can be used to go after malfeasance of any kind, that you can then just claim that someone is doing it. Right. And that's the problem, right? It's not that saying that if an organization is engaged in terrorism, that they should be able to lose their designation. That we can all agree on, which is why it passed overwhelmingly before, right? And so to say that's the problem is not actually, I think, the root of it. The root of it is that Trump is willing to do and has done horrific things in office, and I'll always stand up to that. And so there's no, to me, the situation that we're in is one where the IRS can be used in this way, the DOJ can be used in this way. Any designation that you want can be used to target a group that you disagree with. In fact, they're using just access to federal funding against universities, right? And that you could say, well, how do you legislate out of that? And the answer is, in some cases, you can't. But you do have to, I think, look at it carefully. But in some cases, the problem is that you have a incredibly abusive of power president who's breaking, as I said, the Constitution, violating it on an hourly basis. And we've never experienced that. And this is certainly, I think, beyond even what the first term looked like. And I don't think anybody can say that they had predicted that this slew of horrific things was going to happen, although many of us did warn as hard as we could for months and months and months that this is why this person cannot become president. So, I think that's the bigger concern.
Congressman Allred, we want to really thank you once again for spending some time with us. We really do appreciate it. What would you give us as a parting message to progressives and Democrats across Texas, especially those who are living in Dallas's new 33rd congressional district, as we wind down here?
Yeah, listen, thank you for having me on. I think that we are living through the part of the book where many people want to put it down, and not read the next page. And we don't know yet how that final part of the book is going to be written, but we're all writing it together. And I appreciate folks who are not turning away from turning that page and who are leaning into it instead and saying, you know what, I'm going to double down. And I think this is the time for that. And I think that, we have an opportunity, in selection, to stand up to, a president who is, historically corrupt, historically violating the Constitution, and who in 20 years and 30 years from now, when, books are written about this period, the question will be, did people accept it or did they not? And I think we have to say that we won't. And I was literally willing to, physically fight on January 6th to defend our democracy. I'm a voting rights lawyer, by training. I served in the Obama administration. I served in Congress. I spent my career since I finished playing the NFL in public service in one form or another. And I believe in us, and I believe in what we can do together. And so I certainly am humbly seeking the support of folks in the 33rd district, but across the state. I want to tell folks, not to check out, not to give up, not to give in, to know that what I know as I've gone around the state, that what's going on right now is not what people wanted. I think by and large, they wanted cheaper groceries, and they wanted to have a chance maybe to feel like inflation would go down, and they've gotten the opposite. And for us to not be so hesitant about our footing on some of these issues, and to know that not only are our ideas the right ones, but that the people out there desperately need them to be put into place. And so let's go forward. Let's make sure that we do everything we can to get our fellow Texans involved in this election. I think we have a chance to have a very good one.
Representative Allred, we so appreciate your time and your candid answers today. Where can people find you online if they want to get involved with your campaign?
Sure. They can go to colinallred.com, and I appreciate you for having me.
And just so you know, I'm going to be one of those constituents. My family and I were looking up after the maps passed. Okay, where are we? And we're in the new 33rd. So I'm really interested in your race. Personally, for the benefit of my family, we'd like to be able to afford our grocery trips and keep our kids safe at school and, at the movie theaters and at concerts. And there's so much good that can be done if more people participated in these elections. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure people know how to vote, how to get registered to vote, and when it's time to go vote for these primaries, how important their vote is in the primaries.
That's right. That's right. Well, I'm glad to hear it.
Very, very good. Our mission at Progress Texas is to counter the billionaire and corporate-funded conservative disinformation machine, and we rely largely on listener support to keep doing what we do. While we enjoy the support of hundreds of partners, chances are that you, dear listener, haven't joined the team yet. So if you're a regular, let's please do get you on board as soon as possible at progresstexas.org. Progress Texas is a nonprofit, rapid response media organization promoting progressive messages and actions. While campaigns come and go, we're the permanent home for progressive media and action in the Lone Star State. Chris Mosier wrapping up here for Congressman Colin Allred and Kathleen Thompson. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next time.
Yeah.